The cyber threat environment right now is the worst I've ever seen it in my career. We have attacks on critical infrastructure. We had the attack on the Oldsmar water treatment facility. I don't really think they've yet attributed who actually did that. Colonial Pipeline, these ransomware attacks. For the first time ever, my friends and family actually understand what I do for a living. It used to be you would talk about cyber threats and ransomware and they would have no idea what I was really talking about, but now they do. We're seeing it in our daily lives. So I think that's had a huge impact on certainly our careers, but society as a whole. And I don't know, John, what your experience has been in this whole OT security journey.
Well, because we talked about convergence, we talked about connectivity, and a lot of this is organically happened because we wanted to make things easier, right? So at the turn of the century, a long time ago, I was involved in taking controllers for oil and gas, what we typically call SCADA systems, right? Which used a serial connection that was asynchronous and making it so it could run over Ethernet. Because if we could do that, then you could control it from a long way away. And wouldn't that be awesome? It'd be so easy and fast. But then the attacker said, that's really cool, thanks for doing that for us. And we made it easy for them. So a lot of the things that we've done with the best intentions, but there are other people in the world that take the things we do and maliciously do things to them that we haven't thought about. It's not that people don't care about security. It's just that we don't think about all the bad ways that you could use this thing that we did for good, right? And we're seeing the consequences of it, whether it's Colonial Pipeline. There was a famous case in Finland a few years ago where the electric grid in the middle of winter was taken down and suddenly they had no electricity, which is probably not a good thing to happen in Finland in winter because I hear it's cold up there. And how did they solve the problem? They unplugged it from the internet and it came back up, right? So the fact that we have this thing called the internet means that we're directly connected to the world's most malicious actors. I like to tell people there are no suburbs on the internet. We all live in the same bad neighborhood, right? And I'll have people tell me, oh, I'm not a target. Look, I'm in the middle of some place out in the middle of nowhere and I don't have anything, so I'm safe. The real geographic world has no relationship to the internet world. You're still meshed together with everybody, so you are a target just by the fact that you have interconnectivity.
And companies running manufacturing or ICS, industrial control system environments, have become a big target of ransomware attackers. So, we're talking about critical infrastructure and nation state attacks, but ransomware has really changed the face of OT security because the bad guys realized, when we hit a company that's running manufacturing, that first of all, it's really tough to bring manufacturing back up to recover from a ransomware attack, and they can't tolerate downtime, so they're much more likely to pay the ransom, and that's made us a big target. Look at Colonial Pipeline, look at the impact that had, followed by JBS. And so, unfortunately, companies in OT, like you said, Tony, they've realized we can't not have a security program for our OT environment. In fact, it's interesting, our services team has told me they used to go into customers and they would give them a proposal for whatever the customer wanted Rockwell services to do, and they would always include a security component as optional. And the customers would usually say, we can't afford security, leave that out. But now they said, you can't offer services without having that security component included. So you're right, Tony, the awareness now has reached the threshold where we need it, because that's important in this battle.
You talked about brick and mortar, and you talked about the IT-OT interdependencies, if you will. Just when we think about OT, I think it's important to kind of help define what that might look like to a customer. To your point, Don, there's certainly success that can be found because there's common technologies, whether it be operating systems or computers or servers or network infrastructure that we all understand how to deal with because we've been dealing with it for years. But when it comes to industrial control systems, OT, we're talking about purpose-built devices, right? Embedded devices, sensors, switches, motors, actuators, things that make things move and stir and add chemicals together. These are very purpose-built, dedicated devices that are distributed, right? Distributed throughout plants. And they're very, very diverse in nature. They all perform, again, specific functions. And I think that also poses a challenge of physical access. You can't just lock them all up in a room, right? And when we think about physical access, think about going to amusement parks. People can find their way in areas that they probably shouldn't have access to and do things they probably shouldn't be able to. And so the human element's really, really important. And I think that's something that I think, Rich, you've talked about quite a bit, is around the importance of the human element and considering that.
It's really interesting to me when we look at the history of technology, that we constantly relearn all of the hard lessons as each one of these phases of new infrastructure and application deployment, new networking technologies, all of that kind of comes together. And if we think about the history of technology, there's two realities. The first is that the first reality is we treat it as it's mystical, right? And it's not. Technology is a means of production, right? And as we see the collapse of OT, IT, and kind of all of the challenges as well as risks that are associated with these worlds coming together, we lose sight of the fact that there was a human factor in all of it. It may be functional accounts and it may be machine accounts that are running robotic processes, but ultimately it's producing an output that's used by a human, right? And when we think about the way that the second part of this history of technology, the way that identity became a thing within all environments associated with technology, we go back to 1961. And there's this big argument that goes on between IBM and MIT about who originally had the first account and password. And they've resolved to the fact that it was MIT. And it was a construct that was used to facilitate compute sharing in the CIS course at MIT. It was your time on a computer, and they managed it by giving you an account and password. And what I love about this is in 1961, the folks that were students in that lab have all come forward and said it took us about 11 hours to figure out how to hack that, right? So that I could use somebody else's compute time so I could get more of my homework done, right? Or more of my projects or more of my class assignments. So if we think about 61 accounts and passwords at MIT, that would mean that from a security standpoint, account and passwords are the oldest construct in architecture in all of our IT architectures, in all of our OT architectures. It is the oldest and it is the least changed. And when we think about that from a risk standpoint, it's really not a stretch of the imagination to understand why the bad guys focus so intently on gaining access, whether it be a functional or machine account associated with a manufacturing device or it be an actual identity to aggregate privileges and entitlements to kind of, do bad things, right? Because accounts and passwords are the oldest footprint that we have in the architecture space. And to move into a new world as we focus on zero trust architectures and we focus on capabilities around true identity control, it really becomes how do we bring what were disparate pieces of technology security, firewalls, database security, threat and vulnerability management, patch management, identity, how do we start to bring those together more effectively? And I'm kind of curious, what your experience, Don, has been at Rockwell on that path.
Yeah, so we started with the NIST cybersecurity framework. There was nothing else really available, and really probably still isn't, for designing an OT security strategy. And so we walked through that and we looked, okay, identify asset management. Yeah, that's perfectly applicable, IT and OT. In OT, you need to identify all of your assets and you need to have an asset inventory and you need to know what they're used for. And that way you can go into protect, you can patch them, you can do vulnerability management, you can do identity and access management. So we looked at identify third-party risk. That has changed a lot in OT security as well as IT security, particularly recently. So then you have detect. So what can you do to detect threats in your network? Back in 2016, it was different than it is now. Now we have threat detection technology specifically for OT that we have implemented. And then it was respond and recover. And recover back then, after NotPetya, I think everyone realized, wow, we better think about recover, because that was the big thing after NotPetya. The OT environments that were hit, they had a really difficult time recovering. So for us, we started on recover. That was the first place that we started, because we said, worst case, the whole concept of resiliency. If you get hit, assume you're going to get hit. You have to be able to bounce back. So we focused on recover. So, we've had this manufacturing security strategy for years. We've been executing it. And, John, the father of Zero Trust, Zero Trust was a great concept, but I think a lot of people weren't sure where to start with it.
Right.
And in August of 20, NIST came out with a reference architecture, and it's just been so interesting to see how now the CISO community is really embracing Zero Trust. It must be very rewarding for you after all these years.
Yeah. When I started, people made fun of me. So it's kind of cool to see the President of the United States issue an executive order mandating that all government agencies adopt Zero Trust. But this has been part of my practice for a long, long time. One of the very first Zero Trust environments that I ever designed was for a big manufacturing company. And I was doing a workshop, and the executive vice president of manufacturing came to the workshop, which had everybody freaked out because everybody else was IT people. And he wanted to know, how do I solve these certain issues of manufacturing security, because he was at loggerheads with the security people about things like patching systems and taking them down and doing this. And I showed him, at a high level, how Zero Trust was focused on these specific things. It was focused on what we now call protect surfaces, protecting something, right? Whether it's data or an application or an asset, like an IT asset, OT asset, or a service like DNS or something like that. And he actually shut down the entire workshop and said, okay, all you people are leaving. And I thought, man, I am in real trouble here. But it was just me and him and the manufacturing team, and we designed what the IT/OT system was going to be for this manufacturing system, because that's where all the revenue was generated. And the people who were typically doing security back then, all they cared about were the details. They didn't understand the business value of it, right? If you are a manufacturer, that's how you make your money. And so the first concept of Zero Trust is focused on the business. What is the business trying to achieve? And a lot of people are talking about, in some tactical detail, NIST and other people say it's all about identity, right? And of course, identity is consumed within Zero Trust, but I think we both agree it's not equivalent to Zero Trust, right?
Absolutely. And I saw you speak the first time probably like 5 or 6 years ago. And for somebody that has the history and the background and identity that I do, I didn't come out of the corporate world until right about that time. And I was running identity in the banking industry, and I'd been a chief information security officer. I always like to say, I do identity, but I have other skills that sometimes gets forgotten. But I had something like the reflexive kind of reaction that many people had initially with Zero Trust, which is, it's heavy, it's going to create friction, because I work in the human factor plane of cybersecurity. And over the last couple of years, especially accelerated over about the last year, in talking with John and really getting to understand kind of the volumes of things that are misunderstood about Zero Trust, which I think now is substantially bigger than your initial white paper. When we talked about it, I thought there were really interesting things that helped me associate identity into the zero trust framework. You know, this notion that every packet has an identity, right? That was a revelation for me, that that we have the technological capability, and I knew this intuitively working in identity, that we can really do a lot of cool stuff with being able to assign and associate identities to everything within the digital world. And another, part of our conversation that I thought was interesting just a few days ago about zero trust and identity was I started talking about human and non-human identities. And John was quick to remind me, to be frank, all identities in the digital world are non-human. They're all a proxy, they're all an approximation, they're all a representation of a digital actor that may have a physical equivalent, right? There may be a human. In some cases, there may not be. There may be a digital identity that's associated with a device, a phone, a laptop, a control unit, you name the piece. But being able to identify and then being able to control, traffic flow, data, assets, microservice, API, is really the role of identity within the zero trust framework.
And even if you know the identity and you think it links to a person, it might not really link to that person, which is interesting for me because my expertise used to be insider threat. And so I always thought about malicious, intentional insider threats when you talk about the human factor. But now as CISO, when I see malicious, suspicious activity and we tie it to a user, we can't assume that it is that person that it looks like is committing that activity.
Yeah, that's an assertion, right? Identity is always an assertion, and it's always fungible. There's ways to get around it. So we want to have a high degree of confidence that it's that identity, and then we want to look at that packet, right, and see what it's doing, whether it's behaving appropriately, and then write policy around it. Zero trust is ultimately a layer 7 policy statement, consuming as much information as we can. But we can't say that identity anymore is what we used to think it was. That's where the trust thing came from, right? Trust, what I found, allowed people to just accept a lot of bad behaviors. So I always talk about Snowden and Manning, right? They're the Beyonce and the Madonna.
My favorite. Insider threats.
Yes. They're the Beyonce and Madonna of cybersecurity. They're so famous, they're one-word people, right? And they were trusted users on trusted devices. They had the right antivirus or anti-malware. They had the right patch level. They had robust identity systems. They had powerful multi-factor authentication, the CAC system, right? Which is robust. You would agree it's robust. Hard to use. No one outside the US federal government would use it, but nobody looked at their packets post-authentication. So we've stopped at identity at authentication, and we're not consuming it throughout the life cycle of the packet.
Well, and I think that's the fascinating, consistent and persistent weakness in identity. It's on the pathway to getting resolved. I have a slide that I put up at conferences that I've put up for years. You and I were talking last night about how we constantly share the same themes over and over again until somebody gets it, and then all of a sudden it's the new thing, right? Yeah. And the slide that I share is that on the human element side is somebody logs into something somewhere. Authentication magic happens. And then there's a long period of nothing. Right? The entire in-session experience, there may be a little bit of monitoring on specific assets. There may be step-up authentication if somebody's, a little bit more advanced or mature. But for the most part, like it's you log in and nothing else happens. And I always love I love the real weakness that I think is funny to talk about in any setting, which is, and nobody that I know of on the planet over the thousands of companies that I interact with actually ever authenticates on logout. Right, which is fascinating to me because when you bring this up, people go, well, why would I authenticate on logout? I'm like, I don't know. Do the security guards check underneath the bathroom stall doors in Nordstrom's when they close down the mall at night to make sure that nobody's left inside of the building that can rob them blind and steal everything and just simply walk out? And so this idea of zero trust, when it first manifested, I struggled because my orientation was so heavily focused on that authentication event. And then all of a sudden I realized that the true joining up of identity and its consumability within the zero trust architecture is to eliminate persistent trust. So having been a former chief information security officer and an identity guy, which makes me an insider threat person by nature and design, what I think is really interesting in today's culture that is changing substantially is that up until pretty much the pandemic period, a CISO's job was treated like they were to fix the security problems with technology. And John, I would be interested over another dinner one night to talk about in detail about whether or not we think that cybersecurity is no longer a technology problem. Maybe it never was, right? I talk with companies all the time, and they say, multi-factor authentication you brought up, I think it's great. And they go, well, yeah, we have multi-factor authentication. And I'm like, okay, great. How widely distributed is it across your asset application environment? And they say, well, it covers our critical and SOX applications. And you go, well, how many is that? And they say, well, it's like 200. And I go, well, how many applications your users, your company, your third parties, how many are they actually interfacing with? And they go, well, we do the asset inventory because following NIST. And they go, well, it's like 3,000. And I'm like, so you have 10% of your environment covered with strong authentication, and you believe that security is a technology problem. You have made an intentional decision not to spend the money, leverage the resources, utilize and optimize the solutions that are in your space, and then you wonder how you get hit. You wonder how you get popped when somebody comes in through a lower tier and I think that the way that I've phrased this recently is that we have to be conscious of the trajectory and the patterns that we see. First of all, the trajectory of cyber losses is going like a hockey stick, right? And we all have audit organizations, we all have information security organizations, and we are not being beaten by more and more sophisticated attacks. We are being beaten by social engineering, we are being beaten by ransomware, we are being beaten by open ports, we're being beaten by basic hygiene problems, and so the attackers are using less and less sophisticated efforts, and the solution providers are talking about how great we are at AI and ML, right? There's a definite disconnect when it comes to how we're approaching these problems.
Well, in OT, Tony, it's even, the technological challenges are we haven't even solved the technological challenges yet, right?
I think it's really two things. I mean, you talked about the identity element, and that's long been missing in OT. We have thousands of non-traditional devices that didn't have a concept of ID. They were on the network, they existed, but you couldn't validate who you were talking to. You couldn't verify or authenticate who you were talking to. And so that's something that I know Rockwell has been working on now for a number of years in collaboration with organizations like ODVA that manage a common protocol that is used by many vendors in the industrial space to really bring authentication to the technology stacks that we use in products at Rockwell Automation. So we can now strongly authenticate a device on the network. We can authenticate the communication flows. We can we have some level of assurance that it doesn't just end at a switch or a proxy device, it extends to the device. And so I think that concept of identity in OT and manufacturing is still relatively new, but I'm very encouraged to start to see that become more prominent. And that's something that was very, very exciting to myself is now that we have some more of these hooks, you can really start to bring zero trust to life beyond what some of our customers have been able to do today. And I think one of the other elements you talked about that was interesting was also the behavior element. And you talked about business value, and for a lot of our customers, time to value is a significant metric. How quickly can you bring these things together to make a system run? Yeah. And productivity, security, the long and ongoing battle is how do you make zero trust, zero clicks? How do you make it inherent, design, implemented by default? And that's going to take time. And that's a huge behavior shift because when you're a user on a plant floor versus a user in a cubicle, you have gloves on. right? You're going up to a screen, you're trying to hit buttons, and if you're trying to control a critical service or a critical line, and you need to take control of that, and you have to go through multi-factor authentication, and you get your long password wrong, or you miss it with a glove, that could cause a problem. That could have impact on damaging equipment or maybe potentially hurting someone. And so I think those are the behavior challenges that really our customers are trying to rationalize today, because the environments look different. I don't think anyone argues that they're not good, but I think as we bring these technologies to the market, our obligation as a company, right, and as technology providers, is to figure out how to do it in such a way that we encourage it through good behavior.
And I want to just pick up what you were saying on the plant floor, because it sounds hard. Zero trust on the plant floor sounds hard. But one of the central tenets of zero trust is you design from the inside out instead of the outside in. That's the way we always design networks, from the outside in. In zero trust, you start with the data or the asset or the application or the service that you need to protect. That's called a protect surface. So if it was a manufacturing system running a Rockwell PLC, that's where we would start. We would say that PLC is the protect surface. How does that work? And we would map the transaction flows, and we would understand how it works. So maybe that PLC connects to a single computer, and that whole system is transparent to the guy in the gloves that you mentioned, right? Because there's systems in place where we can write policy and control that flow and make sure it's behaving and acting in the way it was designed to act. And I think it's something that Rockwell needs to take a bow for, because I've been fighting with manufacturers for years. Give me just one little hook to do security. And you guys are doing that, and I know that you don't get to recoup that cost. You don't get to charge extra because you've added security features, but you're doing that for the betterment of your customers, and that's a big round of applause from me. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, thank you very much. And it's certainly been a long journey to get there. At Rockwell, we've had a chief product security officer now since 2013. And one of the things that was important to me in taking this role at Rockwell was the fact that we prioritize our customers and want to enable them to build resilient systems that allow them to operate in a safe and secure way. And so this is one of the reasons we really made this specific purpose-focused role on enabling our customers through security features, security content.
That's why I came to Rockwell. So I came in 2013, and I came from CERT at Carnegie Mellon. And like you, John, I was part of an organization where the mission was to research and develop security solutions to help the world. And it was hard for me to say, I'm going to leave this company with such a great mission and go to Rockwell. But the reason I did was because Rockwell has such a strong security culture. And from the leadership down, security is pervasive. Everyone's on board, and the company understands that our products are in critical infrastructure around the world. So we have a responsibility. We have to build that security into our products, our services, and help our customers as far as how do they build security into their environments.